Up all, Elm Street Warrior here with another video, and today, guys, I'm going to be showcasing my Horror VHS collection. It's been a ride, but it's been a great one. I started collecting in 2019 towards the end of it, and here we are, 2021, 104 titles later. Anyway, let's get into it. First of all, let's start with Vamp, 1986. Definitely a pretty decent film. Before From Dusk Till Dawn, there was actually this movie. Next up, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I actually prefer the series a lot more than this, but I respect this film because it was the introduction to the Slayer. Next up, The Fog. Definitely one of my favorite John Carpenter films and probably in my top 3. The Haunting. I've not watched this one yet, but I did pick it up at the thrift store for 50 cents a couple of months ago, so hey, I kind of just went with it. I'm sure I'll pop it in soon. Next up, The Faculty. Definitely a classic 90s horror film. You could not go wrong with this one. Final Destination 2. Pretty decent sequel. Not as legendary as the first, but still pretty good in its own right. Next up, Prom Night 3. Not as good as Hello, Mary Lou, but I still had a great time with this one. Next up, Demon Wind. I don't know what to think of this film. I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it either. I actually just found it pretty weird. Nonetheless, the cover art to this film is amazing, so I don't know. I guess that's why I mainly picked it up. Next up, The People Under the Stairs. Definitely a Wes Craven classic. I know a lot of people really don't seem to love this one, but I actually did not mind it at all. Identity. I've not watched this one in a long time. I remember watching it as a kid and someone enjoying it. I definitely need to give it the rewatch treatment very soon. The Gate. Absolutely love this one. Discovered this film during quarantine of 2020 and watched it for the first time. Absolutely loved it. Next up, The Hitcher. Definitely a classic film of 1986. I wouldn't necessarily call this a horror movie. It's more of a kind of a thriller, but with each its own, definitely a pretty good movie. Love the ending score to this film. Next up, The Carpenter. Discovered this movie actually on Tubi during the Super Bowl of 2020 and really, really enjoyed this one. Next up, Jaws 2. Not the biggest fan of this sequel. I love the first one, and I don't know, this one kind of just did not do it for me at all. Nonetheless, the cover art to this film, absolutely amazing. Next up, Jaws. Absolutely love this one. We're going to need a bigger boat. Just an iconic shark film altogether. You could not go wrong with Jaws one bit. Return to Horror High. You know, I've not watched this one yet. I kind of just picked it up, but I do need to give this a watch soon. I don't know, something about the cover art to this one really intrigued me, and I kind of just went with it. But I'm definitely going to watch this one soon. Next up, Silent Night, Deadly Night 5. Definitely one of my favorites. I absolutely love this one. And this one has nothing to do with the Killer Santa. It actually has to do with killer toys instead. Definitely a pretty fun sequel, and definitely prefer this one after the original. Next up, Silent Night, Deadly Night Part 2. Basically, half of this movie is rehashing the footage from the original film, while the last, I want to say 30 to 40 minutes has its own new footage. Definitely not up there as the original film, but I can deal with this one a lot better than the atrociousness of Part 3, Better Watch Out. Next up, Silent Night, Deadly Night. Definitely an iconic Christmas horror film. I absolutely love this one. Have the poster here also. Just one of my favorite Christmas 80s slashers to man. Everything about it was just perfect. Keep in mind, this is a VHS boot because the price for the original VHS is just absolutely obnoxious, and I just wasn't dealing with it. Next up, Silver Bullet. One of my favorite werewolf movies ever. Love, love, love this one by Stephen King. Next up, He Knows You're Alone. About a group of girls who get stalked on their wedding day, brides to be exact. Pretty decent film. You know, a lot of slashers came after Halloween, and out of all of them, I feel like this one nailed the atmosphere the best in my opinion. Next up, Brain Damage. You know, a lot of people like Basket Case by Frank Henenlotter, but I actually preferred this movie more. Brain Damage was definitely a weird but fun film. Absolutely love this one. Next up, The Burning. Who cannot go wrong with the summer camp slasher? Definitely a fun one. And this actually was filmed in my home state, so I have mad respect for this movie. The raft scene was just everything in this film. Next up, Chopping Mall. Definitely another fun one. Basically about a group of kids who sneak into a shopping mall and start getting killed off by a bunch of killbots. Keep in mind, this movie actually doesn't have any chopping in it, but still a lot of fun. Can't go wrong with this movie, and hey, Barbara Crampton's in it. Pretty much everything she is in pretty much turns to gold. Next up, Sleepaway Camp 2. Ask me, do I prefer this one over the original one? Absolutely. I love Felissa Rose, but I don't know. Pamela Springsteen absolutely killed it in 2 and 3 as Angela. Love, love, love this sequel. Next up, Sleepaway Camp 2. Pretty much nothing to say about this one. Pretty much love this one as much as I do part 2. Just a fun film, and you couldn't go wrong with this one. Next up, Sleepaway Camp 4: The Survivor. I have not watched this one yet, but I am going to soon. Keep in mind, this is a VHS boot too, as well as 2 and 3. This whole row, actually, all the way until Sweet 16, are VHS boots. I know the production was shut down, I think, a day after this film, so I know I'm not really expecting a lot from this one, but I'm still going to check it out soon. Next up, The Prowler. You know, out of all the movies Tom Savini did, I feel like his makeup work was the best in this film. I know a lot of people appraise his other films, but I really, really enjoyed his effects in this film. Definitely, the pacing with this film isn't the best, but if you're just kind of in it for the kills like me, which this one I kind of was just in it for the kills, it's a pretty good time. Next up, Demons. Absolutely an amazing film. I discovered this for the first time back in 2019 in the summer on Shudder and watched it for the first time. Absolutely love this film. The sequel is amazing as well. I really don't even know what to really say about this film. If anyone has not watched Demons, please get on that because it is just an amazing film. Next up, Sweet 16. This is kind of a whodunit slasher, but this is more the lesser known ones. It has the final girl from Friday the 13th Part 3, Dana Kamel. It's not the greatest, but I actually enjoyed this one for what it was. I actually don't mind whodunit slashers from time to time, and this is kind of one of them. Next up, Dead Alive. One of the grossest zombie horror films alive. That custard scene, man, was just absolutely gross. Every time I see that scene, I just cringe very hard. But nonetheless, decent film. They're not lying when they say in the tagline, the goriest film ever. Because yes, this is the goriest, I should be exact, zombie film to man. Just absolutely a gore fest, but a fun ride at the same time. Next up, we have Child's Play. Not the biggest fan of Chucky, but I absolutely love the cover art to this one and the little horror sticker that's here, so hey, I kind of just got with it with this one. Next up, Class of Nukem High. I've not watched this movie yet. I picked it up at a flea market for like 5 cents, so I'm sure I'll pop it in soon. Next up, Sorority House Massacre. Definitely a cheesy 80s slasher, but I didn't mind this one at all. Definitely a pretty fun one. Shares a lot of similarities to Halloween. Next up, Slumber Party Massacre. For anybody that followed me on Instagram, y'all already know this is one of my favorite 80s horror slasher films ever. Just an amazing film and just fun to the bone, man. Next up, Slumber Party Massacre 2. Not on the same level as the first film, but I still like this one for what it was. A lot of fun, and I really, really enjoyed the Driller Killer, as you see on the cover art in this film. Next up, Silent Rage. This is a slasher movie, or at least I classify it, but it does has action elements. But with that being said, I found the protagonist, the villain in this movie, to be really, really creepy. But nonetheless, I enjoyed this. The Fly. Not the biggest fan of David Cronenberg's films, but he really, really nailed this one. Absolutely love this one, and has one of the grossest transformations to man, I felt like. The Entity. Definitely a pretty disturbing but great film. This is a movie you really know when something bad is about to happen because the music just kicks in immediately and just lets you know. This one actually really left an unsettling feeling with me, but really, really enjoyed The Entity. Next up, Alien. I'm not the biggest fan of this movie. I actually prefer the sequel more. But with that being said, I kind of just got this for collection purposes and the cover art. I do love the tagline to this movie, "In space, no one can hear you can scream." That was something that was just pure genius, and I felt like it really kind of pulled you in. Next up, Children of the Corn. This is a movie, I absolutely loved it as a kid, and then I rewatched this about maybe a year ago, and I absolutely was not a fan of it. I don't know, this one did not age well for me, man. Next up, Saw. Okay, don't yell at me, guys. I've only watched Saw 2, 3, and 4. I have not watched the original film. I'm not the biggest Saw fan to begin with. Only reason I have this in my collection to begin with, because I bought a VHS bundle and the seller kind of just threw this in there for free. I'm sure I'll pop it on at some point, but I don't think that's going to be anytime soon. Next up, Jason Goes to Hell. The Jason movie that pretty much everyone hates. And while I do agree it's not the greatest, I still had some fun with this one for what it was. Again, it's not the greatest, but I enjoyed the design of Jason. I do understand what they tried to do with this one. So I guess it was just kind of whatever. Next up, Jason Takes Manhattan. This, I absolutely have a soft spot for. This was the first Friday the 13th film I ever watched, so I automatically have a soft spot for this one. I know a lot of people don't like this one and call it Jason Basically Takes a Cruise, but I enjoyed this one for what it was. Next up, Friday the 13th Part 7. Definitely a fun film. Definitely one of my favorites in the Friday the 13th franchise ever. Everything about this one I just loved. Jason's look, Tina, the kills in it, the sleeping bag kill to be exact. Just awesome film and one of my favorites in the franchise. Next up, Friday the 13th Part 6. Definitely a movie I didn't like really when I was younger, but as I rewatched it as an adult, absolutely really enjoyed this one, and this is actually in my top 5 of the franchise. The Friday the 13th that everyone likes that I do not care for. It's this one. I don't know. I just don't really care for this one like that, man. I don't know. Maybe I need to give it a rewatch, but I am not the biggest fan of this film at all. Next up, The Final Chapter. Definitely one of my favorite Friday the 13th besides Part 7. A lot of people have praised Kane Hodder for his performance as Jason, and while I'm not knocking that, Ted White absolutely did an amazing job as Jason Voorhees in this film. It was a force to be reckoned with. Just an amazing sequel all the way around. Oop. Next up, Friday the 13th Part 3. I like this Friday the 13th, but in some ways I do feel like it's overrated. I do understand because this is the first movie where Jason legitimately got his hockey mask, but I don't know. I find this film to kind of drag on in certain parts. I don't know. I enjoy it. I just don't enjoy it as much as everyone else does, I guess. Next up, Friday the 13th Part 2. An amazing sequel, and I actually prefer Jason's sack look. I thought it was a lot creepier. Definitely a lot better than the original. The kills are more elaborate. The characters are a lot better. Jenny was an amazing final girl, and is probably one of my favorites, if not the best in the franchise, honestly. Next up, Friday the 13th, the original. Like this film, but like I just said, I actually like Part 2 more. With that being said, love Mrs. Voorhees, and you have to respect this film because if it wasn't for this, the sequels wouldn't exist. Next up, we have From Dusk Till Dawn. Definitely one of those movies that is iconic of the 90s. I really don't know anyone that hates that film. Next up, Sleepy Hollow. I've not watched this one yet. I actually bought this at a garage sale for like 5 cents, and I kind of just went with it. Secret Window. Definitely not a horror movie. This is actually more of a thriller, but I really, really enjoyed the twist that came with this movie, so definitely always remembered that one and kind of just picked that one up on the whim. I actually found that at a thrift store, too. House on Haunted Hill. Definitely a fun remake of the 50s original with Vincent Price. You cannot go wrong with this one. Absolutely loved it. The Exorcist. You know, I'm going to get a lot of hate for this, but I am not the biggest fan of this movie. While it does have some iconic scenes that I really, really enjoyed, the movie as a whole kind of just did not do it for me. I don't know. I've seen better spirit possession films. Next up, The Lost Boys. Watched this movie for the first time in 2019 towards the end of it and absolutely loved it. Definitely, I can see why this movie has the iconic status that it does, and why I do consider it a vampire or a horror flick. I consider it a coming-of-age film for whatever reason also. Next up, The Amityville Horror. A classic 70s film. You know, do I prefer the sequel? Absolutely. Do I respect this movie? Yes, because it was a great starter. Next up, Amityville 2: The Possession. Love this film more than the original for a couple reasons. One, I like that you got to see what happened to the previous family before the Lutzes. And two, the possession scene was really, or the possession scenes in the film I thought were really, really done well. And I hate to like go saying this, but I really enjoyed like seeing the family actually being murdered. Not trying to sound like a psychopath, but it was cool that they kind of incorporated that. So you basically seen everything that happened before the Lutz even moved in. Next up, Amityville 3D. This film is really, really gimmicky, but I kind of understand because at the time that this came out, 3D was really on the rise. We had Friday the 13th Part 3 3D and we had Jaws 3D. So there was no doubt in the mind that Amityville, the Part 3, was going to be 3D. Pretty gimmicky in certain parts, but I didn't mind this film at all. Nightmare on Elm Street, the original, absolutely amazing film. I always say this is one of the scariest 80s horror flicks alive. I don't care what anyone says. Definitely one of my favorites, and I love the cover art to this film alone. Next up, Hell Night. Pretty decent slasher movie about a bunch of kids that go into this house, fraternity kids or college kids to be exact, and start getting basically picked off. Not one of the most memorable slashers and kind of does seem to drag on in certain parts, but I didn't mind this film overall. I actually got this for $6, and I know a lot of people's going to say it's beat up, but for some reason I like my VHSs beat up because I feel like it shows its history. If that makes any sense. Next up, we have The Thing. Definitely one of my top 3 John Carpenter films. You cannot go wrong with this one. Next up, Prince of Darkness. Definitely a movie that no one ever seems to talk about when they mention John Carpenter, and this one actually was pretty good. I would consider this a supernatural slasher movie because they do start getting picked off, but absolutely enjoyed this one. Alice Cooper was absolutely amazing and creepy in this film, I thought. Next up, Halloween 2018. Really enjoyed this one. You know, I know some people, this sequel was kind of a hit or a miss, but I really enjoyed it. I feel like they did everything right, and it was just definitely one of the better Halloween sequels. Next up, Halloween 1978. Definitely an iconic film. Really not a lot to say about this one that we already really don't know about. One of my favorite horror slashers to man. Next up, Halloween 2. Just as great as the original one. Definitely top notch and picks up immediately where the first film left off. Next up, Halloween 3. Definitely didn't like this film as a kid, but as an adult, I've grown to appreciate it somewhat. I definitely respect the different direction that they tried to take with this film. Next up, Halloween 4. The Return of Michael Myers. You know, I'm kind of have a love-hate relationship with this one. One minute I love it, next minute I hate it. However, not a bad film if you can get past the horrible Michael Myers mask used in this one. Next up, Halloween 5. A Halloween sequel that is just hilariously bad. Not the greatest by any means, but whenever I want a quick laugh, I like to put this one on. Next up, Halloween 6. Kind of just neutral with this one. I don't hate it, but I don't love it either. There are things that I liked, but that whole Curse of Thorns storyline, I kind of did without. Next up, Halloween H2O. Definitely another top-notch sequel to me. If you can get past the GCI mask and the soundtrack that sounds directly similar to a Scream movie, pretty good Halloween movie. I absolutely love the ending to this film specifically. Next up, we have Madman. This definitely is a camp slasher that I definitely was creeped out by. Scream, an iconic Wes Craven movie from the 90s. Not a lot to say about this one either. Absolutely love this film. I don't know how I feel about the new film coming out in a couple of weeks, but nonetheless, I'll probably still go see it. Scream is one of those movies, I love it, but I burned myself out with it because I've watched it so much as a kid that it's kind of just one of those movies I really don't watch like that anymore because I absolutely burned myself out with it. But with that being said, still have a whole bunch of love and respect for it. Scream 2, a pretty good sequel. You know, I actually like Scream 3 more, but with that being said, this is a pretty good Scream film. Love the opening to this film, and also this one has one of my favorite Ghostface killers ever. I'm not going to say who it is. Next up, I Know What You Did Last Summer. I loved this movie as a child, but as an adult, I swear to God, this movie has not aged well at all, and is just incredibly cheesy. I still enjoy the film, but you can definitely see its cheesiness now. Still Know What You Did Last Summer. I absolutely like this one more than the original. You know, not the greatest sequel by any means, but I don't know. I found the characters and the storyline just a lot more fun. Plus, Jack Black was absolutely bad in this film that it was just hilarious. Next up, Dr. Giggles. Definitely a 90s slasher that no one seems to ever talk about, and I absolutely love this one. Larry Drake's performance in the film, phenomenal. Next up, Alice Sweet Alice. Not the biggest fan of this film. I don't know. It just kind of really didn't do anything for me. I will say the ending to the film, though, was kind of cool how they left it open. Next up, Aliens. Do I prefer this more than the original, like I said a couple of minutes ago? Absolutely. I don't know. This, I wouldn't necessarily consider a horror movie because it was kind of more action-y. But with that being said, I enjoy Aliens a lot better than the original film. Next up, Creepshow 2. A great sequel to the original Anthology film. You know, I'm not big on horror anthology to begin with, but Creepshow 1 and 2, absolutely amazing films. And here, like I just said, Creepshow, an amazing film. I honestly love them both, so I don't have one that trumps over the other one, because both are just amazing films. Next up, shocker. Definitely a Wes Craven film that is slept on, and is just a lot of fun. Really, really loved this one, for whatever reason. Next up, Hellraiser. Pretty solid film to a starter film to a franchise. Next up, Hellraiser 2. Actually prefer this one over the original one for many reasons. One of the main reasons, it was really cool to kind of see the Cenobites world in this one and to see why they were the way that they were. Just a really interesting sequel. Next up, Hellraiser 3. I absolutely do not like this one. You know, some people do, some people don't. I kind of was one of the people that didn't. I don't know, it just didn't do it for me. I felt like the first two were much better. Next up, Bloodline. I like this one more than I do 3. One thing with this one that I must say was cool, it was interesting to see how the box was made. And I like how they kind of did it by past, present, and future. I thought that was an interesting take. Next up, Army of Darkness. Not the biggest fan of this one. I don't know. It was just way too hokey. Next up, Evil Dead 2. Actually like this one more than the original one. And while this one does have some hokiness in it, the whole movie wasn't hokey, unlike Army of Darkness. Next up, Urban Legend. Definitely a fun 90s slasher film. I absolutely feel like this one gets really lost in the crowd with the other 90s slashers. Urban Legend's Final Cut. Not as great as the original film. Definitely a step down. The only thing I really liked about this movie was, in fact, the opening scene with the kidney heist. Next up, Demon Knight. Definitely a fun one. Billy Zane absolutely kills it as the Collector. Bordello of Blood. Not as good as Demon Knight, and found this one just a little bit too comedic. I like it, I just don't nearly like this one as much as I did Demon Knight. Next up, Cherry Falls. Remember watching this one on USA Network a lot as a kid, and I actually did, for the most part, like this film. I've not watched it in a while, but pretty enjoyable. This is like pretty much post-2000s. Next up, April Fool's Day. I don't know how I feel about this film. I didn't love it, but I didn't hate it either. It's just kind of one of those films I'm kind of really just in a cross between. The Craft. Love this one. I am a big sucker of witches, so this movie absolutely ruled. Really nothing negative to say about this movie at all. Next up, Candyman. Definitely a step down from the original. The original film was so good, and then I don't know where they went wrong with this one at. Definitely boring in my opinion. The only thing that I really liked about this film was the fact that you got to see more of Candyman killing instead of kind of the aftermath like you did in the first one. But everything else just was kind of lackluster to me. Next up, you have Deadly Friend. This is a movie Wes Craven really never talked about, but I don't understand why, because this movie absolutely ruled. Definitely a pretty fun one. Definitely kind of under the radar, but I really enjoyed this one for what it was. Next up, They Live. I wouldn't necessarily classify this as a horror film. This is kind of more political, but with that being said, not a bad movie, but definitely not in my top 4 or 5 John Carpenter films. Next up, Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation. I'm going to get a lot of hate for saying this also, but I absolutely enjoy this one a lot. It is just one of those sequels that is so bad that it's good, and just has some super campy and hilarious moments. Next up, Leatherface 3. I actually like this one a lot also. You know, it's funny because out of all of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies, his sauce seems to be the biggest in this film. I don't know what it is. Next up, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. This one was just a little bit way too hokey for me, and it just didn't work for me at all. Next up, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I'm going to get some more hate, but I actually prefer the remake over this film. You know why? This one does have some iconic moments that were great, and you absolutely have to respect the film as a whole. I don't know, it just didn't do it for me. And last but not least, you have Predator. I honestly turned this movie off within 20 minutes because I just couldn't get into it. I don't know what my problem was with it, but just couldn't do it. Maybe I'll watch it again in the future, but that probably won't be no time soon. Ooh, go back in there. Man, it's going to act like you don't want to go back in there. And there you have it, guys. My Horror VHS collection. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I'm Elm Street Warrior.